$2.3 million. That was the price tag on my father's life. When Corrado Hollis came to collect, I thought I was dead. Instead, the most feared mafia boss in New York walked into the room, slammed the cash on the table, and claimed me as his own. Rain hammered against the corrugated steel roof of my father's auto shop in Queens, each drop sounding like the ticking of a bomb. I sat in the cramped upstairs office, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard, bathed in the harsh blue light of dual monitors. I was Renata Ricci. To the world, I was just the quiet, plus-sized daughter of a degenerate gambler. But in the digital shadows, I was a ghost. For months, I had been auditing the encrypted ledgers of the Eastern Seaboard's most dangerous syndicates, desperately hunting for a missing string of code or a hidden account that could buy my father's life. He owed $2.3 million, a sum that had metastasized from a small sports bet into a lethal debt. Downstairs, the heavy metal door imploded with a deafening crash. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. Heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete. I locked down my terminal, pulled the encrypted flash drive from the port, and shoved it into the lining of my bra. By the time I reached the top of the metal staircase, they had him. Corrado Hollis stood in the center of the garage, looking entirely out of place among the grease and spare parts. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair slicked back, a cruel smile etched into his weathered face. Two of his muscle-bound enforcers had my father on his knees, a cold steel barrel pressed against his temple. Corrado was a loan shark who had carved his way into the upper echelons of the underworld by absorbing the debts of desperate men and extracting repayment in blood and real estate. I walked down the stairs, my steps deliberate and heavy. I did not shake. I had spent my entire life being underestimated, judged for the softness of my curves and the quietness of my demeanor. Let them think I was weak. Corrado looked up, his eyes sweeping over my full figure with undisguised disdain. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He told my father that his time was up. He said the auto shop would cover a fraction of the debt, and my father's organs on the black market might cover the rest. He did not even consider me a viable asset. I stepped in front of my father, shielding him from Corrado's enforcers. I looked Corrado dead in the eye and told him I knew about his offshore accounts in the Caymans. I told him I knew he was skimming off the top of the Irish mob's shipments out of Hell's Kitchen. Before Corrado could process my threat, the rolling metal bay doors at the front of the shop shrieked open. The storm winds howled into the garage, bringing with them a dozen men dressed in black tactical gear, carrying suppressed automatic weapons. They moved with terrifying precision, disarming Corrado's men in seconds. Then a single figure walked out of the driving rain. Carlo Sacco. He was a myth breathed in terrified whispers. The head of the Sacco Syndicate, the undisputed king of the New York underworld. Carlo was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes as black and unforgiving as a starless night. His dark coat was soaked with rain, but he moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the earth he walked on. He ignored Corrado. He ignored my trembling father. His gaze locked instantly onto me. The air in the garage grew suffocatingly dense. Carlo walked past the armed men and stopped mere inches from me. He looked at my face, then traced the line of my throat and the curves of my body. It was not a look of disgust or shallow objectification. It was a look of consuming, violent hunger. Corrado recovered his voice, demanding to know what the Sacco family was doing in his territory. Carlo did not even turn his head. He snapped his fingers. One of his lieutenants stepped forward and tossed a heavy, waterproof briefcase at Corrado's feet. It burst open on the concrete, revealing stacked bundles of high-denomination bearer bonds. Carlo's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in my chest. He told Corrado that the Ricci debt was paid in full. Corrado stared at the money, confused and enraged. He asked what Carlo was getting out of a bankrupt garage and a deadbeat mechanic. Carlo reached out. His large, calloused hand gripping my jaw with a terrifying gentleness. His thumb stroked my lower lip. He looked at Corrado and said, "She is the payment." My father cried out in protest, but a swift blow from a rifle butt silenced him. I stood perfectly still, my mind racing. I had been hunting for leverage against men like them, but I had never expected to become the currency. Carlo leaned in, his lips brushing my ear. He whispered that I was coming with him, and if I fought, he would burn the city to ashes just to keep me warm. I was taken to a penthouse that floated like an eagle's nest above the glittering expanse of Manhattan. The Sacco Syndicate's headquarters was a fortress of glass and steel. I expected a dungeon. I expected a soul. Instead, Carlo gave me the master suite, a room larger than my father's entire house, outfitted with silk sheets, a massive marble bath, and panoramic views of the skyline. But more importantly, against the far wall sat a custom-built workstation with 6 monitors and enough processing power to hack the Pentagon. I stood in the center of the room, my damp clothes clinging to me, entirely disoriented. Carlo walked in behind me, having shed his wet overcoat. He wore a tailored black shirt that stretched taut over heavy muscles. He walked to a crystal decanter, poured a dark amber liquid into 2 glasses, and offered me one. I refused. I demanded to know what this was. I told him I was not some fragile mafia princess he could dress up, and I certainly was not going to be a victim. Carlo laughed, a deep, resonant sound that felt strangely warm. He closed the distance between us, backing me against the edge of the heavy oak desk. He towered over me, a physical embodiment of violence, yet his hands were agonizingly gentle when they rested on my hips. He squeezed my soft curves possessively. He told me he knew exactly who I was. He knew I wasn't fragile. He leaned down, his dark eyes burning into mine. He revealed that 3 weeks ago, someone had breached the Sacco Syndicate's primary firewall. Someone had decrypted their ghost accounts and rerouted $50,000 into an anonymous fund, hiding their tracks with a routing algorithm so elegant it was basically poetry. He had spent a fortune tracking the IP address to a run-down auto shop in Queens. He expected to find a team of professional cyber mercenaries. Instead, he found me. Carlo confessed that he had been watching me ever since. He had seen me walking through the rain to buy cheap takeout. He had seen me working until dawn to keep my father breathing. He said the underworld was full of starving, skeletal women who would betray their own mothers for a taste of power. But me? He saw a queen, a woman with a brilliant, dangerous mind and a body that made him want to commit murder just to keep other men from looking at it. I was stunned. The very thing I thought would get me killed had made me the obsession of a monster. He told me I was his now, not as a slave, but as his equal in the shadows. He needed my mind to dismantle Corrado Hollis's financial empire, and in return, my father would remain untouchable. Over the next few days, the reality of my new life set in. I was treated with absolute reverence by the staff, but the men of the syndicate were a different story. One afternoon, while I was walking through the lower-level war room carrying a stack of decryption reports, one of Carlo's older capos, a brutal man named Vincenzo made a derogatory comment. He muttered something in Italian about Carlo bringing a fat pig into the palace, questioning why I wasn't scrubbing the floors. I didn't need to defend myself, because the room instantly went dead silent. Carlo stepped out of his office. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. He walked over to Vincenzo. Without a single word, Carlo drew a heavy combat knife from his belt and drove it through the back of Vincenzo's hand, pinning it to the mahogany conference table. Vincenzo screamed in agony, his knees buckling. Carlo leaned over the weeping man, his voice a chilling, hollow calm. He told Vincenzo that I was the new god of their financial operations, and if anyone ever disrespected me, he would cut out their tongues and feed them to the stray dogs in the Bronx. Carlo then pulled the knife out, wiped it on Vincenzo's jacket, and walked over to me. He gently took the files from my trembling hands, kissed the crown of my head, and led me away from the blood. That violence shook me, but it also ignited a dark, confusing fire in my chest. He was a monster to the world, but he was my shield. I threw myself into the work. Using the supercomputer Carlo had provided, I tore through Corrado Hollis's digital footprint. My hidden strength had always been pattern recognition. I didn't just see numbers, I saw intent. Late one night, while Carlo was sleeping on the leather sofa in my office, refusing to leave my side, I found the anomaly. Corrado hadn't just bought my father's debt to run guns. He was funneling massive amounts of capital through dummy corporations tied to a private military contractor. I cross-referenced the delivery manifests and the GPS coordinates of the shipping containers. My blood ran cold. The shipments weren't going to a warehouse. They were being routed to the exact location of the Sacco family's underground casino in Atlantic City. And the date of delivery was tomorrow night, the same night Carlo was scheduled to host a sit-down with the regional bosses. Corrado was planning a massacre. I spun around in my chair, shaking Carlo awake. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert, a gun materializing in his hand before he even sat up. I showed him the screens. I mapped out the ambush, showing him exactly how Corrado's mercenaries planned to breach the casino's ventilation system using the blueprints hidden in the financial ledgers. Carlo looked at the screens, processing the catastrophic threat in seconds. He looked at me, a fierce, primal pride blazing in his dark eyes. He pulled me out of the chair and crushed his mouth against mine. It was a bruising, desperate kiss, tasting of whiskey, danger, and absolute devotion. When he pulled back, his hands were buried in my hair, holding my face as if I were the only real thing in a crumbling world. He told me to lock the penthouse down. He said he was going to Atlantic City to turn Corrado's ambush into a slaughterhouse, and when he came back, he was going to show me exactly how a mafia boss worships the woman who saved his empire. The heavy vault doors of the penthouse sealed with a pneumatic hiss, locking me inside the fortress of glass and steel. I was alone, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans and the glow of 6 monitors, but I had never felt more connected to the chaotic pulse of the underworld. I strapped a tactical headset over my ears and let my fingers fly across the mechanical keyboard. I was not going to sit and wait like a helpless prize. I was going to be Carlo Sacco's eyes in the sky. I breached the Atlantic City Casino's mainframe in less than 4 minutes, bypassing their outdated firewall and overriding the security protocols. Across my screens, a grid of grainy black and white camera feeds flared to life. The underground casino was a labyrinth of velvet-lined gaming rooms, private vaults, and winding subterranean service corridors. The regional bosses had been quietly evacuated hours ago. In their place, Carlo's elite enforcers crouched in the shadows, their weapons drawn, waiting in total silence. Through the central camera, I saw Carlo. He stood in the middle of the main baccarat floor, a solitary, terrifying figure in a tailored black suit. He was completely exposed, smoking a cigar, with maddening calmness. He was the bait, and Corrado Hollis was walking right into the trap. My headset crackled, and Carlo's deep, gravelly voice filled my ears. He asked if I had eyes on the perimeter. I told him I had full control of the grid, from the lighting to the automated blast doors used for vault security. I warned him that thermal imaging showed 3 heavily armed tactical teams breaching the casino's northern ventilation shafts. Carlo did not flinch. He took a drag from his cigar and told me to let them get all the way to the main floor. He wanted Corrado to think he had won, right up until the moment he lost everything. I tracked the thermal signatures as Corrado's mercenaries crawled through the ductwork and dropped into the service corridors. They moved with military precision, stacking up behind the double doors that led to the baccarat floor. I held my breath, my hands hovering over the keyboard. I watched the countdown on my synchronization program. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. The doors burst open. Corrado's men flooded the room, assault rifles raised, sweeping the area for targets. "Now," I whispered into the microphone. I slammed my palm down on the enter key. The execution script ran flawlessly. In a fraction of a second, every light in the underground casino shut off, plunging the space into absolute darkness. Simultaneously, I triggered the electronic locks on the reinforced steel blast doors, sealing off every exit and trapping Corrado's men inside the kill zone. Through the infrared feeds, the massacre unfolded. Carlo and his men, equipped with night vision optics, moved like phantoms. The suppressed gunfire was a rapid sequence of flashes on the monitors. It was a brutal, systematic dismantling of Corrado's forces. The mercenaries fired blindly into the dark, their bullets shattering chandeliers and tearing through velvet curtains. But they were shooting at ghosts. Carlo moved through the chaos with terrifying efficiency, a predator in his element, his movements precise and lethal. But Corrado Hollis was a snake, and snakes always have a contingency. On my 4th monitor, a red warning box violently flashed onto the screen. An alert siren blared in my headset. Someone was attempting to hack the penthouse's local network. I frantically typed a tracer command, my heart dropping into my stomach. The breach was not coming from outside. It was originating from a localized terminal on the lower floor of the Sacco headquarters. Corrado had a sleeper agent inside the building, and they were trying to override my lockdown to let an exterior hit squad into my sanctuary. I told Carlo over the comms that we had a breach in New York. I told him someone was inside the building, trying to open the penthouse vault doors. Gunfire roared over the frequency. Carlo's voice, usually so controlled, spiked with raw, unrestrained panic and rage. He yelled at me to get to the panic room, demanding I barricade myself and wait for his local men to sweep the floors. He swore that if anything happened to me, he would drown the city in blood. I ripped the headset off. I was not going to hide. If I ran to the panic room, the sleeper agent would gain access to my terminal, drop the building's exterior defenses, and let a small army into Carlo's headquarters. All the financial leverage I had built, all the evidence against Corrado, would be wiped. I had spent my whole life retreating. I was done running. I pushed away from the desk and looked around the massive suite. Carlo had left a heavy, customized Glock 19 on the nightstand. But I had never fired a gun in my life. I knew my strengths. I was a woman of heavy curves, soft flesh, and a brilliant, calculating mind. I fought with electricity, not bullets. I ran to the server rack built into the wall behind the desk. It was a massive tower of processors and cooling units that drew power directly from an industrial-grade backup generator. I pulled open the maintenance panel and ripped out the primary grounding wire, exposing the raw copper. I dragged the thick cable across the floor, pooling it near the entrance of the suite, right where the vault doors met the marble flooring. The heavy pneumatic hiss echoed through the room. The sleeper agent had cracked the secondary lock. I grabbed a metal water pitcher from the wet bar and poured it across the marble, ensuring a continuous puddle connected the copper wire to the threshold of the doors. I retreated behind the heavy oak desk, grabbing the Glock just in case, my chest heaving with adrenaline. The heavy vault doors slid open. A man in the uniform of Sacco's private security stepped into the room. A suppressed submachine gun raised to his shoulder. He scanned the room, his eyes darting past the shadows. He took one step forward, his heavy tactical boots planting firmly in the puddle of water. I slammed the main breaker switch on the server rack to maximum output. A shower of blue sparks erupted from the floor. The man convulsed violently, a choked scream escaping his lips as massive amounts of raw, ungrounded electricity surged through his body. His weapon clattered uselessly to the floor. He collapsed onto the marble, twitching and smoking, completely incapacitated. I stood there, my hands shaking violently, the smell of ozone and burnt fabric filling the air. I had held the line. I looked down at my soft hands, at the fullness of my body that the world had always deemed weak, and realized I was a weapon in my own right. 2 hours later, the roar of a helicopter engine rattled the glass walls of the penthouse. The storm outside had intensified, lashing the city with relentless rain. I was sitting on the edge of the leather sofa, a heavy blanket wrapped around my shoulders, staring blankly at the unconscious traitor who had been zip-tied and dragged away by Carlo's loyal guards moments before. The double doors of the suite burst open. Carlo stood in the threshold. He was completely drenched, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His expensive suit was torn and stained with dark, heavy patches of blood. He looked like a demon dragged straight from the depths of hell, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and desperate as they scanned the room. When his gaze found me, the tension in his massive frame broke. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees on the floor in front of me. This man, the undisputed king of the New York underworld, a man who had just slaughtered an entire mercenary crew, buried his face into my lap. His large, blood-stained hands gripped my thick thighs like I was the only anchor holding him to the earth. He was shaking. Carlo Sacco was shaking. I reached out, my trembling fingers burying into his damp hair. I whispered his name, telling him I was okay. I told him I held the room. Carlo lifted his head, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that stole the breath from my lungs. He reached up, his rough thumbs gently wiping away a tear I had not realized I shed. He looked at my face, then let his gaze travel down my full figure, wrapped securely in his blanket. His look was one of absolute, terrifying reverence. He told me Corrado was dead. He said he had snapped the man's neck with his bare hands the moment he realized the New York headquarters had been compromised. He confessed that the flight back was the longest hour of his life, a waking nightmare where he imagined arriving too late. He told me he had conquered territories, crushed syndicates, and amassed fortunes. But nothing had ever brought him to his knees until he met a brilliant, beautiful hacker in a run-down auto shop in Queens. I looked down at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reminded him that I was not a mafia princess. I told him I was heavy, I was stubborn, and I came with baggage that would drag a lesser man down. Carlo let out a dark, ragged laugh. He stood up, towering over me, before leaning down to scoop me into his arms. He lifted me effortlessly, the strength in his broad shoulders easily bearing my weight. He carried me toward the massive king-sized bed, his gaze never leaving mine. He told me he didn't want a fragile princess. He said he wanted a queen who could lock down his fortress and electrocute his enemies without blinking. He laid me gently against the silk pillows, following me down. His heavy body pressed against mine, his heat radiating through his damp clothes. He mapped the curves of my hips and waist with his large hands, squeezing my flesh with a possessive hunger that made my blood sing. He whispered against my lips that every soft inch of my body belonged to him now, just as every violent, broken piece of his soul belonged to me. He promised that my father would live the rest of his days in a gated estate in the Hamptons, untouchable and debt-free. He promised that the Sacco Syndicate would bow to me not just as his woman, but as the architect of their future. When he finally kissed me, it was not rushed. It was a slow, consuming claim. It tasted of rain, danger, and a fierce, unbreakable devotion. I surrendered to the weight of his body and the terrifying safety of his embrace. I had spent my life hiding in the digital shadows, ashamed of taking up space in the real world. But under Carlo's hungry gaze, I was finally seen. I was exactly the payment the underworld demanded, and I was going to rule it by his side. Thank you so much for listening to this dark mafia romance. If you felt the tension and loved seeing a curvy, brilliant heroine hold her own alongside a fiercely protective mob boss, please hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Leave a comment below telling me your favorite moment, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping, high-stakes underworld dramas. Your support keeps these stories coming.